Claude 3.5 Sonnet is better in almost every benchmark than OpenAI's GPT-4o. That means it should perform better on any question we ask it, right? Well, let's find out. We're going to run some head-to-head tests where we will give each model the same prompt and see which is better. But before we get into that, let's look at the highlights of Claude 3.5 Sonnet and the benchmarks comparing it to other models like GPT-4o. So, with this release, there are 5 highlights I want to look at. First, let's talk about how smart it is. Claude 3.5 Sonnet is a beast in the benchmarks. It claims to surpass pretty much every other model on basically everything. Benchmarks, of course, do have their flaws, but the one I trust the most is the graduate level reasoning. This is basically a very advanced test written by PhDs in their respective fields. When given to domain experts, the average score on this test was 65%, and your average non-expert got 34%. So Claude 3.5 is closing in on the average domain expert in all fields. Absolutely mind-blowing. Second, it is really good at coding. Anthropic did their own internal testing and showed that Claude 3.5 Sonnet completed 64% of problems compared to Opus, which only completed 38%, which is a massive improvement considering Opus was state-of-the-art a few months back. Coding benchmark I trust more than their internal one, however, is done by the developer of one of the best large language model coding tools, Aider. This benchmark shows that Claude 3.5 Sonnet just leapfrogged GPT-4o and is completing 78.2% of their problems correctly, while GPT-4o is at 72.9%, which is a massive improvement because the higher the percentages we get to, the more difficult the remaining problems are. So it's amazing. Third, it is state-of-the-art for vision capabilities. As you can see, Claude 3.5 Sonnet claims state-of-the-art in 4 of the 5 presented benchmarks. I haven't dug into the vision benchmarks too much, so it's tough to know which are quality and which aren't, but either way, they are some massive jumps. Fourth, Anthropic announced a new feature called artifacts. When generating content like code snippets or text documents or something like that, a window appears on the side and it gets filled with this specific text. If it's HTML or JavaScript, it actually gets run, so you can see it live there working. So for instance, if you wanted to create a game with Sonnet, you can do it right in the editor and it'll pop up and you could play it. To me, it feels a little bit like a toy at the moment, but I imagine as the models improve, it can be really, really powerful. And finally, this thing is just fast. Check out how fast it's generating text right here. Claude 3.5 Sonnet responds around 80 tokens per second, which is lightning fast. That's a little bit faster than GPT-4o and way faster than Claude Opus. All right, so now it's time for the showdown. Side-by-side tests between Claude 3.5 Sonnet and GPT-4o. I'll present each model with the same prompt and evaluate their responses. For each test, I'll choose a winner based on my somewhat subjective criteria and award points right up here for the winner. I'm the sheriff of this YouTube channel, so whatever I say is best, and if I am challenged in the comments, I will defend my choices vigorously. Now, we have 8 topics to cover with multiple tests for each, so let's get started. First up, let's look at creative writing. People have always claimed Claude to be better here, but let's see for ourselves. I tried to be a sci-fi writer once and was told a good place to start is with flash fiction. These are extra short stories, less than 750 words, but often much shorter. It can be really hard to provide an emotionally engaging story with so few words, so let's see if either of these AIs are up for the task. They undoubtedly will be better than me. So let's try this prompt. Write a flash fiction story about a time-traveling detective, and we'll keep it to 200 words just so it's easier to compare. Actually, let's make this a time-traveling bunny detective. All right, we'll run it in both and see what happens. So I'll post a link where you can read these side by side, but I'm just going to take a second, read each of them, and then we'll award a point. Okay, So I just read through and there is an obvious clear winner with Claude 3.5 Sonnet. GPT-4o pretty much was like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. There's no emotion, no dialogue. It's just boring. Claude 3.5 Sonnet, on the other hand, starts a really compelling story. And at the end, I wanted to read more. So clear winner here, Claude 3.5 Sonnet. The next creative writing thing I want to test out is poetry. So let's do a simple one. Create a poem about a rainy day. See what happens. All right, again, so I'll post a link to these so you can read them side by side, but give me a quick sec, I'll read through them. All right, so I read through them. Clear distinction is GPT-4o wrote a much longer poem. And even with all that extra length, it's kind of boring and generic. Claude 3.5 Sonnet was only 8 lines, but I can't even really put to words why I liked it so much better. So again, it's my subjective take, but another point for Claude 3.5 Sonnet. All right, on to our third test. So another difficult aspect of fiction writing is creating realistic, believable dialogue. So let's see if these two models can do it. I was thinking the prompt of create a dialogue between a dragon and a knight. See what happens. All right, last time I'm going to say this, but there'll be a link so you can compare these two. But give me a chance to read this. Okay, I read through it. Again, obvious winner here with Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Much more believable dialogue, much more engaging story. Clear winner. Round 2, image descriptions. So I'm going to feed some images in and ask the models questions based on the image. The images and the questions will get harder and harder, and we'll see how they do. For the first one, I'm going to show it this image right here and just ask it to describe what it sees. They both got it right. I guess this one was a little too easy. The only real difference here was Claude 3.5 was much more detailed, but GPT-4o had pretty much all the same stuff, so no points. Next up, I wanted to try a little more difficult of one. So this image is of Obama putting his foot on the scale, and I'm going to ask the models why this is funny. So this specific image has been talked about before with regard to AI, and it's pretty difficult for AI to understand humor. And in this case, even more so because it kind of has to understand physics and a bunch of other things. So let's try it out. Looking at this, GPT-4o did understand it's funny because Obama is pranking the guy weighing himself. Claude 3.5 Sonnet thought more it's funny because normally the president is pretty stoic and everyone's in their suits in a locker room, but it missed the big humor part of it. So that's a point to GPT-4o. For the third image test, I want to give it a diagram and see what it says about it, see if it gets it right. Here is a pretty complex diagram. I found this diagram on the internet, and basically it's trying to map the flow of an enzyme structure. Okay, I don't know. It's a very complex biology diagram. As far as I can tell, they both got everything. Haven't seemed to find one bit of missing information from either of them. So no points awarded here. They both did great. Now we'll test coding. I'm gonna ask the models to code some things, then I'll run whatever code they spit out without modifying a thing. And we'll see if any of it works. I've given many coding interviews over the years, and most of these questions are just simplified versions of what I might ask a human programmer. For the first test, we'll just do a basic HTML, CSS test and see how they do. We'll go with this prompt. Create HTML, CSS code for a responsive navigation bar. This isn't the easiest CSS task, nor is it the hardest, so let's see how it goes. Okay, before we even dive into this, there's some things I want to bring up. First, Claude 3.5 Sonnet used its artifacts feature, and we can play with the navigation right here, which is actually really slick. The other thing I want to bring up is GPT-4o used JavaScript, which is really annoying because I just said HTML and CSS. But either way, I'm going to go run this code now and we'll see what happens. Oh, looking at the code now, Claude 3.5 Sonnet also used JavaScript. Okay, even there. Here is the web page that Claude 3.5 Sonnet built. As you can see, it looks pretty good. The links all seem to work as expected. I'm going to open the debug menu so we can shrink it and see if the responsive part works. It should soon switch to a mobile view. Yes, it did. Great. And if I click this, awesome. That looks pretty dang good. Even has some animation effects. I'm impressed. All right, now let's check GPT-4o. And here's the web page that GPT-4o built. See how it works. So the links all work as expected. It looks pretty dang similar, to be honest. Let's open the debug so we can shrink it. Shrinking. Okay, so when I shrunk it, the hamburger menu thing popped up. The header did increase in size a little bit. That's okay. See if opening it works. Okay, that's pretty funky. That definitely does not look as good as the drawer sliding out. This thing pops way over to the side. Yeah, it's just not as good. Yeah, and the links disappear again when you make the web page big again. I can't believe I'm saying this, but GPT-4o lost. Wow. For the next coding test, I was thinking we could try some JavaScript. Let's try the prompt. Generate a JavaScript function to create a countdown timer that updates every second, start at 10 seconds. When I was a junior engineer, I actually had to build this, and there are a lot of gotchas. So let's see if these two are up for the task. I'm gonna paste in the JavaScript right here, and you should see the console update with the timer. All right, it worked. The code does have one issue, that it's not exactly 1 second between ticks. It's probably closer to a second and a couple milliseconds. It's a pretty easy mistake to make, and I think the majority of software engineers would make the same mistake, so it's okay. Now let's check out GPT-4o's solution. It used a little bit different code, but basically doing the same thing as far as I can tell. So it worked also. Let me take a quick look at the code and see if it's up to snuff. Okay, so I just took a look at the code and it works, but there's some funky stuff that I would call out in a code review. Without getting into too many details, there's just some confusing bits, like this seconds variable isn't even needed. Timer and duration are identical, but it's a little confusing. So yeah, even though they both work, I much prefer Claude 3.5 Sonnet's version. So I'm giving a point there. For the next coding test, I want to see how well they can build out a scraper in Python. So here's the prompt. Write a Python script to scrape all the headlines from PokemonDB.net. Each headline is in a link inside an H2 element. So I'm giving all the context it would need in order to do this. It's a fairly straightforward task, but it needs a lot of stuff, so let's see how it does. Here's the results from each of their scripts. They both got all of them right, so the scraping worked. Now I'm going to take a look at the code and see if either of them really stand out from the other. Taking a look, they both seem pretty much the same. I wouldn't really prefer one over the other, so no points on this one. All right, so last test for the coding. Thought it'd be fun to kind of see if in just one shot, either of these models can create a working Pong game. So let's try it out. All right, here's what we got from Claude. It did use a Python library that did almost all of the heavy lifting. So it probably was just taking what it found online a million times, but it works. Nothing much to it. It works fine. All right, well, let's check out GPT-4o's. Here's GPT-4o's. Seems pretty dang similar. Okay, but there is no... Oh, it's 2-player. Okay, I see. The other one had some kind of weak AI. GPT-4o made a second player. That's pretty sweet. Now I'm going to take a look at the code and see which one I like better. Looking at the code, I wouldn't say I like one more than the other. So again, another toss-up. No points. And round 4, sentiment analysis. So for this one, I'm going to give it some sentences and tell it to analyze the sentiment in 3 words. Let's see how they do. So this was a really easy one, and they both did great. No points here. Next up is a sentence that is a little more difficult to understand. So I thought the movie would be terrible, but surprisingly, I ended up loving it despite its flaws. Overall positive, but there's some negatives mixed in there. Might trip it up. Let's see. Okay, GPT-4o said pleasantly surprised, positive. That is right. Claude said initially negative, ultimately positive. That is right, and actually I would say better description, but that's 4 words. I said 3. So the sentiment analysis, good, but it's losing a point because that's 4 words. Next up, let's try probably the hardest sentence for them to analyze. Despite the phone's sleek design and impressive camera quality, the inconsistent software updates and battery life issues ultimately overshadowed my initial excitement. Let's see how they do. GPT-4o said disappointed, critical, frustrated. That's pretty spot on. Claude said disappointed but balanced. I guess? It's a little weird. I'm going with GPT-4o again. On to round 5, question answering. So I'm going to rapid fire 6 questions to each model, and I'll split the 3 points depending on which model was better. Questions are mostly fact-based, so it's either right or wrong. First, I asked my wife, who is a therapist, to give me a random fact she knows. And she gave me one about her favorite celebrity therapist. What year did Esther Perel get married? The correct answer is 1985. So let's see what they say. Wow. Okay, so GPT-4o said 1982, which is wrong. And Claude 3.5 Sonnet says it doesn't know the answer. I definitely prefer if it says it doesn't know the answer. So that's heavily weighted towards Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Let's ask some more. For the next one, I'm going to ask, who was the 11th person to walk on the moon? The right answer to this is Gene Cernan, and neither of them got it right. GPT-4o said Charles Duke, and Charles Duke is the 10th person to walk on the moon. Claude 3.5 Sonnet said Alan Bean, which was the 4th person to walk on the moon. So neither of them got it right. Disappointing. Let's try a slightly easier one. Which country has the most pyramids? The answer to this is Sudan. So GPT-4o got it right, and Claude 3.5 Sonnet got it right. Cool. Here's a little more difficult of one. Do limes float or sink? And the right answer to this is limes sink. GPT-4o got this one right, and Claude got it wrong. Interesting. Okay. So that's 2 that GPT-4o has gotten right, that Claude has gotten wrong. Now, this one is a little more ambiguous because it could be taken in a few ways. So what is the world's smallest mammal? The answer I'm looking for is the bumblebee bat, but that's actually by size, not by weight. So let's see what they say. They both got it right, but GPT-4o mentioned that by length, this shrew it's talking about is actually smaller, which is honestly a better answer. So another point for GPT-4o, I think. Now the last one I'm going to try is just a random fact about countries and GDP. What country had the 5th highest GDP in 2018? The correct answer is Germany. Let's see if either of these can get it right. So GPT-4o said United Kingdom, and Claude 3.5 Sonnet said United Kingdom. Okay, they're both wrong. So it was pretty clear that GPT-4o was better at these types of facts. So I'm going to give 2 points to GPT-4o for this whole category. And one thing I just sort of want to bring up about this category is I think this is the absolute worst way to use large language models. They are not fact machines. I think the best way to use them is more like a reasoning engine. So if I gave it tons and tons of data and then asked questions on that data, that would be more like a reasoning engine. But I just thought it would be useful to test because a lot of people use large language models like this, even though I think it's the wrong way to use it. Round 6, image generation. All right, so this one is a bit of a red herring. Anthropic doesn't have any image models. So with ChatGPT, I use DALL-E quite a lot just because it's integrated and so easy. So for this category, 1 extra point for GPT-4o. Next up, conversational skills. Here we will test how well each model can engage in natural language conversations, maintain context, and just feel like a real person. A prompt I had in mind for this one is, I'm feeling a bit down today, can you cheer me up? With this test, I'm really looking if the responses show empathy, remember details from previous messages, and just generally feel natural and ultimately cheer me up. So what I'm gonna do is just have a conversation. I will post these conversations in the description of this video, and then at the end, I'll tell you my findings. It's just some quick back and forth, and very clearly, Claude 3.5 Sonnet is the winner. It's much more empathetic. It's much more natural sounding. It's trying to hear what I'm saying and trying to cheer me up a little bit. GPT-4o, on the other hand, has all these lists and just right out of the gate was like, here's 8 ways to feel better, rather than kind of listening, and it just didn't feel like a human and it didn't feel good. So all 3 points go to Claude on this one. And the final round, summarization. So I'm gonna give some dense articles and see how well each of these models summarizes the article. I'm going to start with a really long and dense article about charging electric vehicles. After looking at the 2 summaries, GPT-4o's was much, much better, but it was much longer than 300 words. So I don't really want to award any points. GPT-4o hit every single point in the article, and Claude 3.5 Sonnet missed a lot. So no points here. The next thing I want to test is a research paper I'm quite familiar with. This is the foundational paper for transformers, which is the architecture that both Claude and GPT-4o is based on. Here we go. They both finished. Let me take a quick second and review, make sure it got everything. I've reviewed them both, and personally, I a little bit more prefer GPT-4o's version. It goes into more depth and nuance, actually. I think Claude 3.5 Sonnets is a little more high level. I think that probably the mistake was with me not telling it what kind of summary I want. I think they did about the same, really. I'm not going to award any points here either. The final tally is 6 points for GPT-4o and 8 points for Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Honestly, much closer than I expected. Now, what does this mean for which model you should use? Well, there are a few changes I'm going to make with how I use these models. First, I'm going to immediately switch to all of my coding tasks to use Claude 3.5 Sonnet. I'm just blown away how much better it is here. Second, I'm going to likely switch the majority of my company's API usage to Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Not only is it cheaper, it seems to just have more nuance. I'll of course need to run specific tests for our use cases, but I think it's going to perform pretty well. Third, and this one might be a surprise, I'll probably continue using ChatGPT for my day-to-day. Why, you might ask? Well, ChatGPT has all of my custom GPTs, internet searches, pretty good image generator, and voice chat. I use all of those enough that I don't think it's quite worth switching yet. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more videos like this in the future, and you might be interested in this video right here. Later.